Hey, welcome back to AgEcon. I hope you guys are excited to tug into Unit 2. We've just finished wrapping up an awesome start to the class with Unit 1, looking at the foundations of economic thinking, and now we're ready to look at microeconomics, and that's a big word. Microeconomics focuses on the economics of smaller scale businesses and organizations and the decisions of people like you and me in the individual market. So microeconomics focuses on that, and that's what Unit 2 is about. This is our segue into Unit 3, which is macroeconomics. And macroeconomics looks at the economies of the world and how the different microeconomies and the different organizations and people that make up the world work together to create trade and policies that are equitable and resourceful. So microeconomics, the best way to start it off is looking at how shift happens and how supply and demand are constantly in battle with one another, as we talked about in Unit 1. And how we can best mitigate that and use that to our advantage also in the economy. So to get started today, we're going to quickly review some of the concepts from supply and demand, because depending on when you're watching it, it might have been a few days or maybe even a week because you had that test in there. And then we're going to look at the factors that influence supply and demand shifters. And finally, we're going to wrap up by getting you introduced to different agricultural commodities and how they impact us as you get introduced to your commodities challenge or commodities in action project that you'll be working on over the next couple of days. So let's dive in, and we'll start with our learning targets. First, we will be able to recall our basic knowledge of supply and demand concepts. Then we'll be able to identify factors that influence or shift supply and demand in the economy. Then we'll be able to demonstrate supply and demand shifters based on present factors. Then we'll be able to interpret information about an agriculture commodity. And finally, we'll wrap up by applying our knowledge of supply and demand to the agricultural marketplace as we look at different commodities. Okay, so why don't we review basic supply and demand concepts together, just so we're all on the same page. Okay, here we have the outline for what you hopefully recognize as a supply and demand graph. Now, I want you to grab out a piece of paper or open up a Google Doc or whatever you want to do to jot your memory of what a supply and demand graph looks like. And here's what I want you to include. Now, I already gave you price and quantity, but I want you to draw where price and quantity go on the supply and demand graph. Then I want you to draw a supply line, draw a demand line, tell me the point of equilibrium, and also label where shortages and surpluses will be located. Okay, so why don't you hit pause, work on that for a little bit, and then report back when you're done. So now that we've sketched out our supply and demand graphs, it's time to check our knowledge and see how we did. So the first thing that I would label on here is my supply and demand line. So hopefully you remember that supply goes to the sky, demand goes to the dumps. So supply is always going to be increasing, or excuse me, as price increases, quantity is going to be increasing. That is what results in our upward sloping line. This makes sense because if you're a business and you're supplying goods, you're going to want to supply a higher quantity if you're able to sell it at a higher price, and you're going to want to supply a lower quantity if you're selling it at a lower price. Okay, so you want to make money, obviously. That's kind of the way to look at it from a supply side. And the opposite is true from a demand side. You want to save money as a consumer, right? So you're going to be more willing and able from a demand perspective to pay less for a product and get more of it in turn. Okay, so as the price, when the price is high, the quantity demanded is low. And when the price is low, the quantity demanded is high. And that's what results in our downward sloping graph. Okay, and then the next logical thing to label is your point of equilibrium, and that's where supply and demand intersect, where that X happens. Okay, point of equilibrium. Then your surplus and shortage. Surplus is going to be located above the supply and demand point of equilibrium, and shortage is going to be located below that point of equilibrium. The way to confirm this is notice where the surplus line meets the supply line, okay? Right over here. If we go down to quantity, we'll notice that surplus means there's a higher level of quantity than there is at the point of equilibrium. That makes sense, right? Because when there's a surplus of goods, that means there's more than enough. We have too much. So if we're supplying too much, that's going to be a surplus. The same is true with shortage. Look at that shortage line, meet it over at supply, then take a look. Okay, that quantity is going to be lower at a shortage than it is at the equilibrium. Okay. So those are the 7 basic elements of a supply and demand graph that I asked you to include. Hopefully you remembered those, and if you didn't, that's okay. That's why we review, that's why we look back on concepts and apply them to one another. Okay, so lastly, as we wrap up our review of supply and demand, a few questions I have for you to think about and consider. So first, are supply and demand prices and quantities always constant? Yes or no? Hopefully you answered no. They are not always constant. They may be for a little bit, or it may appear that they're a little bit constant, but they are not always constant because consumer trends and supplier abilities are constantly changing back and forth. That's why we have that supply and demand political cartoon with the 2 guys arm wrestling. Okay. Number 2, what are some factors that influence a buyer's ability to purchase a good or a service from a supplier? Well, folks, there's a lot of different factors, and I'm not going to ask you to know every single one of them, but you should be able to identify maybe a couple examples that might influence your ability to buy something at a store. For example, one thing I mentioned last time we did one of these videos was the time of year. I'm going to be more likely personally to buy a watermelon in July than I am in January. Just kind of a freshness thing for me. Additionally, perhaps the amount of people that you're living with. For me, I'm living by myself. I don't need to buy 6 pounds of asparagus to sustain myself for 3 days, right? I might want to buy a little bit so I could grill some or put some on the stove to have with my dinner, but I don't need to. I'm not buying for an army by any means or a huge family. So that influences me. Also, my income influences me. The amount of incomes that you have coming into a household can influence you as well, right? If you have a family of 4 but only 1 income, you're probably going to be having different spending behaviors than if you're a family of 4 with 2 or maybe even 3 incomes, okay? Likewise, for number 3, what are some factors that influence a supplier's ability to sell a good or service to its buyers? Well, one of them is the price in which they are receiving the goods that are on the store shelves or in their bakery, or the inputs, the price that they're receiving from their original supplier. So how much is the flour? How much is the chocolate? How much are the eggs? Those different things, if those prices go up or go down, that very well could influence the amount of supply that that business or bakery or grocery store or what have you is able to provide for consumers, right? Additionally, the amount of stores or businesses in that community that they're competing against. Okay, that could also have a huge impact on a supplier's ability to sell a good or service. Okay, I'm sure we could think of many, many more, and that's okay. But basically, just know that supply and demand are a thing. It's very important, and they work hand in hand, and then you'll be in good shape. Now, we just talked about how supply and demand are never really constant. They're always changing. Therefore, as economists and as market analysts, we can sit around a table and kind of predict what we think is going to happen in the economy, but the reality is we don't really know. It's kind of trial and error sometimes. So we have to be flexible and ready and prepared in case there is a shift in either the supply side of things or the demand side of things. And that's why we study supply and demand shifters. Now, we have a couple rules of thumb that I want to share with you. These are going to help you a lot moving forward, okay? Whenever we increase supply or demand, so when I give you a scenario and I say there is a drought on the alfalfa farm, or there is a drought on the corn farm, or there is a drought on the tomato farm, or maybe there is something going on that's impacting the supply or demand, when we are decreasing, we are going to the left, and when we are increasing anything, we are going to the right. Okay, so increasing a supply or demand quantity, you will be shifting your line to the right, and decreasing, you will be shifting to the left. We do not shift both lines at the same time unless told otherwise. And the reason being is because, generally speaking, if we go back to that toilet paper example from Unit 1 that I shared during the coronavirus, yeah, there was a huge spike in the demand for toilet paper, but toilet paper companies like Charmin couldn't just snap their fingers overnight and say, boom, here's all the toilet paper, hope you're satisfied. Nope, it takes time. We got to hire on people. We got to innovate technologies. We got to produce the natural resources that are needed to actually get that toilet paper from the factory to the store, right? Okay, so it takes time. So we're only initially going to see a change in either supply or demand, and then the other line later on could possibly be adjusted, right? That's kind of how it works. So When we give you a problem or we ask you to identify something based on a present situation, we want you to look at what is changing first, not what is changing later. What is changing first, okay? So rule of thumb, if we have an increase, move to the right. Rule of thumb, if we have a decrease, move to the left. And rule of thumb, shift one line at a time. Those are your 3 rules of thumb. Don't forget them. Okay, there's a lot here. Okay, I would recommend you pausing this or taking a picture of it with your camera, your iPhone, whatever you got, or going back to this during the practice problems if you want. This is kind of how this graph works, or this chart works. At the very beginning, we have an event. That is the scenario we give you, okay? So let's say, for example, we're in the corn market and there is a drought, okay? That's the event we'll go with, okay? Change in number of buyers, change in the values of buyers, change in the cost of sellers, change in the number of sellers. The first thing that we need to do is identify if this is going to be a buyer or a seller thing, okay? Now, obviously, buyers influence demand and sellers influence supply, okay? Now, if there's a drought, that's probably not going to change the number of sellers that we have because all of the farmers are generally going to be experiencing the drought at the same time, but it will influence the costs of the sellers, right? Okay. Now, is this going to then, if we move into step 2, increase the costs of the sellers or decrease the costs of the sellers? Well, if a drought is happening, that means it's going to be more costly because they're going to have to use more water or natural resources to help irrigate or take care of their crops. Okay, so then we're going to follow along. We identified change in the cost, that it's increasing in step 2. Okay, that's going to cause us to do a decrease in supply. The way we can confirm this is this black bold line right here. That is our initial line. That's where we started, okay? When the drought happened, we shifted that supply line to the left because remember, decreases cost shifts to the left. Okay, that is going to then lead us to this step 3, determining the effect on the equilibrium point. Okay, as we can see, because our line shifted to the left, that drove up our prices and decreased our quantity, right? We started here, we ended here. So we saw that our price went up and our quantity went down. And that makes sense because if there is a drought in corn, there's going to be less corn available, so lower quantity, and the price is going to be higher because there's less corn to have. So the stores and the markets are going to increase the prices to really truly see who in the market is willing and able to sacrifice to get that corn for their meal or for whatever they're using that corn for. Okay, that's kind of how this chart works. You can kind of follow along for the different scenarios that we give you. For me, step 1 is kind of confusing for me sometimes. So once you get really good at this, you can kind of just see, all right, is this going to influence supply or demand? Is it going to increase it or is it going to decrease it? And what's it going to look like? Then you don't really have to use this chart. But the key thing is, at this point, you want to be able to identify, is this a supply issue or a demand issue? And what is the effect in that issue? Is it going to increase supply or increase demand, or decrease supply or decrease demand? Okay, so feel free to go back to this as needed, but we're going to talk now about the factors that cause these lines to shift. Okay, so demand shifter factors. First, change the number of buyers. If for some reason we just have like this huge massive amount of increased consumers, like there's a lot of people who are immigrating, or there's a generation that grows older, like the baby boomers, for example. If we were to have that happen again here in 2020 or 2030 in that decade area, when they grow up, there's going to be a change in the number of buyers, like drastically, okay? Number 2, change in the buyer's taste, preferences, or new trends. So if, like the previous example I shared in the last video about avocados, like I'm not a big avocado guy myself, but I know it's very trendy right now. A lot of teens and people in their 20s and 30s and even older are really trying to get into this avocado thing because of its good taste, nutritional value, and it's becoming very popular on basically anything. So that's becoming a big thing. So it's shifting the demand to the right because we're increasing our demand. Number 3, changing the income or wealth of the buyers. If the government were just to give you a $5,000 check, some of you might go ahead and save it, but I think I would be willing to bet that a lot of you be more willing and able to go out to the market and purchase things, whether you need them or not. Changes in the income or wealth is going to increase demand. Okay. Likewise, if there's a depression or a recession, that's going to decrease your willingness and ability to buy things and maybe just buy the bare necessity. So instead of buying 2 gallons of ice cream, maybe instead you buy 2 gallons of milk because you can use that milk to make your own ice cream or make your own dairy products instead. Okay. Change in the price of other goods. Complementary goods are things that go hand in hand together. So if our ketchup and mustard market, for example, if a price of mustard goes up but ketchup stays the same, that could very well affect the demand for ketchup. Okay, it could make the ketchup be more popular, or maybe for some people they might not want to purchase ketchup because they only have ketchup and mustard together. They don't buy them, have one or the other. Okay, so complementary goods can influence demand. Also substitute goods, so things that can be substituted for one another. Okay, so if we have 2 different brands of, or like dark chocolate and milk chocolate, for example. Okay, most recipes or most people are willing and able to substitute those for one another. So if the price for one or the price for another one goes up or down, depending on, that could influence which good is being purchased more. So obviously the one with a lower price is probably going to be purchased more than the other one generally. And the last one on here, change in consumer expectations. So if some research or information comes out about genetically modified organisms, for example, whether that's making consumers more afraid of genetically modified organisms or more confident in that technology, that could change the demand. Because if studies are saying, GMOs are bad for you, or they're scary, or these things going on in the media, that's going to influence consumer expectations and therefore decrease demand for those genetically modified products, and increase demand for products that are not genetically modified. But otherwise, or on the other hand, if people were to realize the positive benefits of genetically modified organisms, or some additional research came out making consumers more comfortable purchasing or enjoying genetically modified organisms, that could therefore increase the demand for genetically modified organisms in those products. Okay, looking at the supply side of things now. The first thing for the factors is the change in the number of sellers. So just like with consumers, if we have more people, there's going to be more demand. Likewise, if there's more sellers, there's going to be more competition, and therefore that could influence the amount being supplied in a community, state, region, whatever. Likewise, too, if we're in town and Staples here, for example, John and Ernie's are our 2 grocery stores. If John's goes out of business or if Ernie's goes out of business, that influences the amount of sellers in town. Therefore, the amount of corn dogs that are supplied in Staples changes. That's kind of the way it works. Okay, or if we got a third store in here, if we had Joe's store show up, that would increase the number of sellers and increase the amount of supply. Number 2, change in the productivity of suppliers. So if John's hires 10 new workers, or their current workers get a lot more productive, or if Ernie's workers gets more productive, or any store really, that is going to impact the amount of supply. Another example too could be a bakery. If the Staples Bakery, love their donuts by the way, they're really good. If they went ahead and had an additional worker or 2 hired on, and they became more productive as a business, they'd be putting out more donuts and more cookies and more brownies. Kind of like what we saw with the example in Production Possibilities Frontier when they hired on that additional worker. They're expanding their Production Possibilities Frontier. They're also increasing their supply by shifting that to the right. Okay. Number 3, number 3, change in the price of resources. So at Staples Bakery, if their original supplier of flour drove up their prices and the sugar prices were driven up too because of a drought or something, that would therefore change the price of the initial resources that we're getting and potentially impact the amount that we're willing and able to supply as the Staples Bakery. Those factors are production. Okay. 4th, change in government policies or regulations. So this one's kind of a little bit harder to wrap our minds around, especially because we're just focusing on micro and not macroeconomics right now. But if, for example, the governments came out and increased the price of minimum wage for employees, and we were paying our employees a minimum wage, we may have to let 1 or 2 employees go at the bakery, and therefore we aren't going to be able to supply as much or not have as good a productivity because we have less employees working at any given moment. Number 5, then, change in consumer or supplier expectations. So if the consumers suddenly realize that donuts are miraculously healthy for us, That's going to therefore increase the consumer demand, and therefore the suppliers are then going to expect themselves to supply more for the community. Likewise, too, if the suppliers are recognizing different food safety or different ways of doing things around their business or their bakery, that's going to change their expectations, and therefore they are going to want to either produce more or less depending on what that factor is. Okay. So feel free to jot these down, hit pause. Pretty good information to have for now. Let's kind of take this into perspective so you guys can kind of visually see what happens to the different graphs. Okay, so graph A shows supply increasing. So when supply increases, we notice that our price decreases, in that equilibrium point, our price goes down and our quantity goes up. Okay, an example of this, when we're talking about dairy for all four of these examples, 10 brand new dairy farms opening in Todd County. So if 10 new dairy farms open in Todd County, that's going to increase the amount of dairy milk that we have, and therefore we are going to see a lower price because there's more milk to be had in Todd County. Graph B shows supply decreasing. That's going to cause our price to drive up and our quantity to drive down. So an example would be a nasty drought killing the alfalfa crop in many Minnesota fields. Okay, so again, to clarify, when we look at price and quantity, we look at the equilibrium. So what happens to that equilibrium price and quantity during that shift as a result of that shift? Okay, going to graph C and D. Graph C illustrates demand increasing. So when that happens, our price goes up and our quantity goes up. Because there is a demand increase, people want that product, therefore there's going to be more demand for it, and therefore it's going to become more valuable in terms of money value. An example, a new study reveals that milk adds years to your life. So if that were to be true and that was well publicized and people understood that, potentially that would increase the demand. In fact, it would. And graph D, demand decreasing. So price goes down, quantity goes down, and an example would be non-dairy substitutes like almond juice or soy juice gaining popularity on the market or within a sub-market of individuals like teenagers or males, females, whatever. Like if it gains popularity in one of those like sub-markets or those groups of people, it can have a very big implication on the entire dairy market as a whole. So hopefully this example here about dairy kind of showed you how things can be affected on the supply and demand side of things, whether that be increasing or decreasing. Okay, one thing I want to mention too before we move into the individual practice time is there is a difference between a primary and a secondary market. So in most of the examples I just shared, the main market that was affected was milk or dairy. So that first example about having an increase in the amount of dairy farms in Todd County, that the primary market would be raw milk. However, a secondary market for that example could be cheese, because cows, when we milk cows, the cheese doesn't come out, milk comes out, right? So we further process, therefore a secondary market that could be affected by that is the cheese market. We maybe could see an increase in the amount of cheese that is produced in Todd County or in the state of Minnesota. Another example, when we talked about alfalfa and there was a drought in Minnesota that hurt the alfalfa crop, okay, the primary market of that isn't dairy because alfalfa isn't just used in dairy. The primary market is alfalfa because it's going to impact those alfalfa farmers directly. That is the first primary market. The secondary or other market then could be dairy or any other livestock species that utilizes alfalfa as part of the diet or ration. Okay, so let's practice. So for each of the scenarios relating to the cotton industry, so all three of these scenarios at the bottom are about cotton. Number one, I want you to tell me which graph A through D is represented. Number two, tell me what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity. And number three, give me an example of a secondary market, not a primary market, a secondary market that is impacted. Okay, so go ahead, hit pause, report back when you're done, and go through the answers. All right, so now that you have had some time to try this out on your own, let's review together. So a new policy restricting farmers from planting GMOs, like cotton. So GMOs are genetically modified organisms, as we talked about. And if a policy is therefore going in and limiting what a farmer can or cannot plant, do we think that's going to affect supply or demand? And is it going to increase or decrease? Well, hopefully through deliberating and thinking to yourself, you recognize that graph B is the correct answer. Therefore, our price is going to increase and our equilibrium quantity is going to decrease. Okay, the reason why it is graph B is because it is impacting the farmers. The government is going in and impacting the farmers and telling them what they can or cannot plant. And therefore, we are going to be decreasing our supply because there is a restriction. Okay, the price is going to go up because there's less available, and the quantity is going to go down because there's less available. And the secondary market could be polyester fibers, because now if there's less cotton available, maybe we're going to be utilizing more polyester and creating our clothing. Okay. Second example, polyester prices decrease. Now, remember, we're talking about the cotton market. Okay, so don't let this one trick you. Which graph did you select? Hopefully you selected graph D, because we are looking at the polyester market. If those prices decrease, generally, because it's a substitute good in some cases, the quantity demanded for our cotton is probably going to go down unless we lower our prices too for cotton. So graph D is the way to go. Our price is going to decrease, our quantity is going to decrease, and a secondary market that could be affected by this is the cotton t-shirt market. Okay. And the last one, a geneticist discovers a gene that triples the amount of cotton produced in one plant. Okay, so think to yourself, is this going to impact demand or supply? Hopefully you pick supply, and that narrows it down to A or B. And is this new gene going to help or hurt the supply? Hopefully you selected help, and that leads you to graph A. That causes our price to decrease, our quantity to increase, and a secondary market to be identified of maybe cotton genes. Okay. So now I want you to practice one more set. Now definitely on your own. Again, all of these events are independent. I want you to look at these three. First, farmers invest in new irrigation technology that saves the corn plants from drought. Second, ethanol is endorsed by NASCAR as the smart option. And third, petroleum prices plummet. Okay, so again, remember, ethanol is a corn-based product. Okay, so that should give you enough information for what you need to know to be successful here. Okay, why don't we go through the answers then? First one, farmers invest in new irrigation tech. Graph would be graph A, right? The supply is going to increase because there's new technology we're better able to produce. The prices are going to decrease and the quantity is going to increase. And a secondary market that could be impacted is animal feed. Okay, so if we are producing more corn, therefore we will be able to produce more animal feed and sell that directly to the farmers. Okay. Number two, ethanol is endorsed by NASCAR as the smart option. Okay, graph would be graph C, because NASCAR is getting behind a product and saying this is smart, go buy it. It's likely going to increase the demand. Therefore, our price and our quantity is going to increase. And the secondary market that could be affected is the petroleum market. Okay. And the last one, petroleum prices plummet. That means they go down. Okay, so if the petroleum prices go down and they're competing against the ethanol, and ethanol prices stay the same, that could mean some bad things for the ethanol market. So our price, or our graph that we're going to pick is graph D, and our price and our quantity are both going to decrease. Another example of a market that could be affected is asphalt, because petroleum is actually utilized in creating asphalt. Now, obviously, petroleum is the primary market that's affected, but asphalt market could be affected likewise. I'm sure you might have other answers down for that too, for those secondary markets, and that's totally fine. Just come up with an example of one additional market that would be affected besides just the primary market of petroleum. So hopefully this kind of makes sense, identifying that graph, equilibrium, and secondary. And remember too, earlier in the slide, I had that nice little chart that had the event at the top, and then what happens is affects supply or demand. Is it increasing or decreasing? And then what the graph looks like and what is the result in the price or quantity. That will be a helpful resource for you as you work through the rest of this unit. So Lastly, to wrap up, I'm going to introduce the concept of commodities. So dairy, corn, soybeans, these are all different commodities in agriculture. Commodity is a raw material or primary agricultural product that can be bought and sold, such as copper or coffee. Your teacher will provide you with some additional information and resources for the Commodities in Action or Commodity Challenge project, and that will enable you to understand a little bit more about how different prices and consumer demands and consumer trends influence commodities as a whole, especially for the ag, food, and natural resources industry. So I hope that this presentation kind of helped share a little bit about supply and demand, why it's so important and why it changes so much, because shift really does happen. It's important for us to be proactive and understand why those shifts happen. So today you were able to recall your basic knowledge of supply and demand, identify factors that influence or shift supply and demand in the economy, demonstrate supply and demand shifters based on present factors, interpret information about a commodity, and apply your knowledge of supply and demand to the agricultural marketplace. So tune in. We're going to keep chugging along with microeconomics over the next few series of videos. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, AgEcon. Hang in there.